Sharing live.
Okay, so hi, my name is Sebastian Budgen. I'm a founding member of Historical Materialism Journal and the book series and the conferences, some of which you will already be familiar with. So I wanted just to pitch to you the idea of you subscribing to the journal. Firstly, the journal comes out 4 times a year, published by Brill, over 1,000 pages of extremely important and stimulating Marxist theory and Marxist history. We have a discount at the moment for individual subscribers around the time of the London conference, and we very strongly both request and demand that you subscribe to the journal, that you get other people to subscribe to the journal, and of course that you get your institution, if you're part of a university or other institution, to subscribe to the journal. We need more subscribers for this project to be able to expand and continue. The second thing I really wanted to push was the book series. The book series you also probably be familiar with. It's published by Brill Academic Press, and then all the volumes come out 12 months later with Haymarket Books in Chicago, paperbacks. We have more than 200 volumes published now, of translations, of original work, of document collections, of translations from Marxist theory from across the world, from Japan to China, to India, to Latin America, very important Latin American list shaping up in the book series, and so on. It's a really crucial intervention in Marxist literature, in making Marxist theory available, that really hasn't existed on this scale since the 1970s. So we'd like you to look at the book series, buy individual volumes, perhaps take up the offer of the book club that Haymarket is promoting. And also, of course, if you're part of an institution, to get your institution to buy as many volumes as possible. Those are the 2 key elements of our activity, aside from the conferences, the journal and the book series. And we think it will be, it's essential basically for us, for our existence, for us to be able to continue to thrive, for those to expand. So please subscribe to the journal, buy the books in the book series, publicize both around you, and help us build the Historical Materialism project. Thanks.
Hello, my name is Javier Moreno Zacares, and I'm chairing today's last session, a presentation and discussion of the book Jurisdictional Accumulation, an early modern history of laws, law, empires, and capital, published by Cambridge University Press. The book is on this year's shortlist of the Isaac and Tamara Deutscher Memorial Prize, the winner of which will be announced on Friday. We will be opening with a book presentation by the author, Maïa Pal, a senior lecturer at Oxford Brookes and editor of the Historical Materialism Journal. The presentation will be followed with a roundtable discussion, and our discussants today are Heide Gerstenberger, now retired, but formerly at the University of Bremen, Fred Guillaume Dufour from the University of Quebec à Montréal, and Robert Knox from the University of Liverpool. Now, before we proceed, let me just remind you that the recordings of all the streams from the Historical Materialism 18th Annual Conference are available on YouTube, and you can find them on the Haymarket Books channel. All right, Maïa, the floor is yours.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Heidi, for the introduction, and thank you to everyone for being here. Before I share some slides, which is slightly taboo, HM, but just a couple of excuses, I guess. I'm 7 months pregnant, so I might make some funny faces while I'm talking, and I'm pretty tired and I've been teaching since this morning. So I need slides with pictures and colors to keep you awake. No, hopefully it will give us, help give a broad view of what the book does and some of the key arguments. So without further ado, I will share my screen. And if I can just get a go ahead that this is working. Yeah, Javi, we all good? Is that sharing? Okay, I'll assume it is. Okay, so I'm going to basically present the book for about 20 minutes and tell you about what is jurisdictional accumulation, basically, which is obviously the main argument and point about the book. And I'm going to talk about the empirics and the historical aspect, which are key to the book. And I'll finish and talk a bit more about the kind of methodological and debates aspect, which I think will be perhaps more of the discussion that we can have about, what does it actually mean and why does this matter to do this history, to go back to the early modern period, which the book is mostly concerned with. So this is kind of the simplest way I can summarize what jurisdictional accumulation is, and this is a concept that I've come up with. It's basically the practices of a neglected set of sub-sovereign actors in the history of international relations and international law. So my work has tried to kind of bring together international relations and international law from a historical sociology perspective. So I'm speaking to a lot of debates and issues, I guess, in those areas. And the people I'm referring to in the book, and I try and emphasize and reconsider in a different light, is our ambassadors, consuls, so kind of specific types of diplomats that I'll talk a lot more about in a second. More generally, lawyers, parliamentarians, magistrates, theologians, other clergy, and merchants, significantly a lot as well. So these are the people I'm interested in this book. So it's it's not a history from below as such, or a history of resistance in any way. Although we could talk about that, but it's more about these sub-sovereign or intermediary actors and their role in shaping new legal institutions and mechanisms of imperial ordering and expansion. So there's two big, I guess, empirical claims that I make to try and revisit early modern imperialism. And I look at 4 empires. So the Castilian or Spanish Empire, the French, the English and the Dutch, English and then British, obviously. And I differentiate what these empires do in the early modern period. And there are exceptions and nuances to these 2 categories I use, but broadly, I use the term of transplants of authority, which are used by the Castilian Empire in the Americas, and also a bit less significantly by the French Empire in Europe through the aristocratization of ambassadors, impossible word. So that's a key point I make, which kind of builds on secondary literature on what the Castilian Empire is doing in terms of giving subjects a jurisdictional identity in the empire, and this is not necessarily a good thing, obviously. It's the way in which the Castilian Empire manages to dominate and chooses to colonize through specific processes, the requerimiento being a very known one, but also the haciendas, the encomiendas, the specific cities that were built up, the tribunals, all these ways in which various types of jurisdictions were developed. And so the idea is that they transplanted their authority, right? So there was a kind of hybrid, organic process of movement of authority that happened from Castile and more broadly in the Spanish reinos or kingdoms to various parts of the empire. So there's this very specific process of colonization that happens there. That's contrasted to transports of authority, which are more characteristic of the Dutch, English, and French empires, through notably actors or sub-sovereign actors that I mentioned before, early modern consuls, so these diplomats that were posted in port cities and trading cities, and that represented local nations, community of foreigners, but also settlements, trading companies, and the geographical focus here is on the Mediterranean and the Americas. So it's kind of an outsourcing of processes of colonization and imperialism through this transport. So rather than transplanting it, it's literally just moving it from different actors. So there are kind of nuances and exceptions, obviously, to these categories. They're never perfect, but I think it gives a better sense of some of the differences that are happening in this period. So the idea is to kind of also revisit early modern imperialism in terms of jurisdictional or extraterritorial struggles. And I'm not going to talk too much about this in this forum because, I want to talk more about the Marxist debates and what it means from a more Marxist perspective. But there's a whole discussion about what extraterritoriality means in this period and all the debates and kind of more mainstream IR and international law about the development of extraterritoriality, of sovereignty, of territorial sovereignty, etc. So that's a big part of the book, which I'm not going to focus on too much today. What I'd like to talk more is about diplomatic agency and international order from a Marxist perspective, if you want. And I think what has been, there is Marxist histories of diplomacy are lacking, and we could do much better. And this book is an attempt to do some of that, right? To re-engage with social history from a Marxist perspective in terms of these key agents that have been, obviously talked about a lot, and for some cases, such as ambassadors, less so for consuls. So what I argue is that there's a reproduction of sub-sovereign actors or intermediaries as key class struggles. Right, so I mentioned already the aristocratization of ambassadors, so that's a key struggle that I identify across kind of broader northern, western, eastern Europe. Social property relations are a key concept. I kind of use political Marxism a lot and develop it in the book to trace the differences between non-capitalist and capitalist expansions. And I also try and develop an argument about the various forms of mercantilism in the Mediterranean, the different empires that are contesting various processes of mercantilism. So this is an example of a bit of the archival work I did in the book, and I quote it here because it's just interesting about it exemplifies the kind of class struggles that are happening about these and this kind of Marxist approach to diplomacy. So this is a memorandum from 1677 asking the French king to replace the Istanbul ambassador with a resident consul. And I'm not going to read it in detail, but basically it's quite funny. And it's basically merchants writing to the king and saying that the ambassador is an aristocrat and he's lazy and he doesn't know his job and he's just interested in prestige and they've had enough. And the community of merchants want a consul instead, and they're petitioning the king. And this is interesting because it went quite far up. So Colbert, Louis XIV's first minister, obviously that responsible for most of the changes at the time, really pushed to have this change. And so there was this tussle, at the highest levels of French administration about what kind of ambassadors should there be in the Mediterranean, the advantages of ambassadors, aristocratic ambassadors, which were only recently becoming, really exclusively limited to aristocrats. It was a profession that was actually much more varied before the 17th, 18th century. So that tussle between what kind of class should represent sovereigns was really interesting. And just another example, I'm not going to go into much detail here, I don't have time, but of what this kind of approach looks like when we look at the French Empire in the Mediterranean. And so we have these complex jurisdictional struggles between a whole set of actors. So what I'm basically arguing is that the early modern is a really complex picture of jurisdictional accumulation, right? And there's, it's a period that is sufficient in itself. It's not a period of just transition, right? The early modern is a really problematic term. And so there's these conflicts and power relations between merchants, consuls, the power of Marseille, regional institutions, the Chambre de commerce de Marseille, the Parlement de Provence, les intendants, the royal agents, a whole big set of reforms that affected consuls. Again, I'm happy to come back to this in detail, but it's a bit of a rabbit hole, but it's really fascinating what how France is innovating in these consuls and the ministers. And so there's a balance between the monarchy wanting trade to flourish, but expanding its control over the revenue that's being produced by this trade, right? And so the monarchy is really trying to figure out how to tap into this really expanding Marseille's trade. And obviously merchants and consuls trying to obtain privileges and payments from the king. So more focus on private mechanisms and practices, a reformulation of public and private, political and economic in this period. Jurisdictional accumulation indirectly creates wealth through the accumulation of claims, rights, titles, functions, and statuses. And this basically refers to the sale of office, of privileges, which then generate revenue and access to taxes on wealth and trade. But for me, jurisdictional accumulation is not a process that is purely meant to create wealth, to directly create wealth, right? It's primarily a process that is about accumulating jurisdiction, as its name claims, and it's about emphasizing that process, right? And we'll talk about what this means for circulation, production, and commercial capital in a second. But I really, want to emphasize that this is about specific functions, rights, titles, etc., and the battles that merchants, consuls were involved in to access those rights, titles, and functions. And consuls are the perfect example of this, but they're not alone. The aim was to be able to buy an office or to be given it by the state, which then was starting to attribute it, and through that office generate some kind of profit. But it wasn't that easy. So we come to the kind of debates in Marxism, I guess, that will be interesting to discuss. And I've been thinking more and more, I guess, since as well the book has been published. And this issue of the circulation production debate, and the more I think about it, the more I want to overcome it, especially in the period of the early modern, where I think it's perhaps creating more problems in some respects, but that will be a matter of debate, I'm sure. So basically, jurisdictional accumulation for me is not a capitalist process because there's no direct aim to transform social property relations through economic means. And there's no transformation of labor or of relations of production through market imperatives. So you'll recognize that the political Marxist definition here, obviously, of capitalism. So I'm obviously differentiated from that. So for me, jurisdictional accumulation is tangential and only potentially linking to significant commercial capital. Now, that people can use that term if we want. It's not a term I'm particularly keen on using because I think it's confusing, but there's obviously so much work on this today, and this is a big debate. So it's not to say that commercial capital isn't significant in this period, but I think by just focusing on commercial capital, we're missing on this other process of jurisdictional accumulation, and it's making us miss a lot of what's happening. Obviously, there are exceptions as well to all these aspects. Right? So more generally, a lot of other contributions that I try and make in the book are obviously going against linear and consequentialist transitions. I'm not interested in building this kind of stages, developmentist history of capitalism. I really want to focus on the early modern period and provide a kind of a new narrative of jurisdictional forms of capital. Think about what that might mean, and thinking more generally about jurisdiction as a more important concept than it's been given credit. I'm sure we'll come back to these debates on the commodity form theory of law. The book is also a critique of the commodity form theory of law, specifically its historical, some of its historical elements, and how, in my view, it doesn't help us explain what's going on in the early modern period. So that's obviously a key point of discussion. So I'm sure we'll come back to that. I'm going to try and kind of finish through what I have here before coming back to that. But the other key point I make is that I defend a method of outward internalism. And there's internalism has got a lot of bad press because of being considered methodological nationalist and very problematic to just start from one locale and expand it other ways. And in many respects, it is problematic. But doing it in a specific way where you argue that a specific process needs to be understood from its origins and how it moves, and I'm interested in the mobility of authority, I defend it as a useful method and as one that, like any methodological choice, has its advantages and disadvantages. But it's one that I defend as useful to try and expand the specific types of expansions that I look at. And Eurocentrism, obviously, which I'm sure we'll come back. The book is empirically Eurocentric in some ways. It starts from Europe, but it tries to do something that is methodologically anti-Eurocentric by trying to bring back the story of the Mediterranean, the story of what's happening in certain colonies in terms of jurisdiction and how that's really shaping imperial expansion. So my last point, I think I'm running out of time, is further debates. I guess the book is trying, or hopefully in the future also will continue developing, and trying to really, as I said before, think about jurisdiction as potentially a new way for thinking about sovereignty. And this relates to a lot of debates in international relations, but not only. Thinking about what jurisdiction is, this kind of this more creative aspect of legal formation, rather than just the established right, which is sovereignty, and trying to think of different ways of understanding legal transitions and legal actors through that concept. So there's a lot of literature today on maritime factors, terraqueous sovereignty, concept of multiplicity, which I'm more or less comfortable with, and I'm not sure to what extent these are new ontologies. I think jurisdictional accumulation has a lot to contribute to those debates, and in a way I'm rejoining a lot of what is being said in a lot of these concepts, which are focused much more on circulation. But I think I'm trying to say something different than those. And finally, I hope to do a lot more archival research on the early modern Mediterranean and these different class strategies of expansion linked to consuls, which I think some of us have in this group have been working on as well, and we'll be really looking forward to doing. So I think I'll leave it there. I have a few minutes left, so I've raced a bit through it, but maybe I'll just leave the time to come back on some of these issues and the points that the discussants will raise. So thanks again, and I'll stop sharing now.
Great. Thank you, Maia. Thanks for that. Excellent timing. Let's move on to the discussion. Heide, do you want to go first?
Yeah. Good evening, everybody. Jurisdictional accumulation is a breathtakingly argued and wonderfully innovative piece of analysis. My comments are restricted to those arguments and concepts which have given me food for thought about my own analysis. There's quite a bit of correspondence between Maïa Pal's concept of early modernity and my own concept of ancien régime. Both are meant to stress that if, in retrospect, these periods in European history were pre-capitalist, this outcome was not a given. And if there was nothing like a determined development to capitalism, there also was no linear trend to modern political sovereignty. This insistence on the fact that the future of the societies in question was open calls for the analysis of their political economies. Maïa Pal has explained the differences in 4 European empires, and she has shown how these also shaped strategies of internationally transplanting, transporting, or extending authority. But she also suggests that the analytical concept of mercantilism allows us to catch a general characteristic of this epoch. I usually refrain from making use of the term mercantilism because more often than not, the underlying analytical concepts are rather based on contemporary economic theory than on analysis of the political economies of the time. But Maïa Pal's suggestion to define mercantilism as a category for political surplus can be accepted as a very apt conclusion to a long and often fruitless discussion. This definition is adequately general to also contain the realization that jurisdictional privilege was a form of property, while at the same time preventing to conflate external similarities of appropriation strategies with the explanation of a general road to capitalism. This brings us to the analytical insistence which is already present in the brilliant title of the book. While the formulation jurisdictional accumulation refers to the growth of government, it also hints at the fact that jurisdiction could be made use of for accumulating private wealth, achieving social advancement, and political power. Different positions offer different possibilities. While the position of ambassador offered political power as well as social preeminence, some potential candidates refused to accept the position of ambassador because they did not want to take on the expected costs and possible dangers. Consuls, on the other hand, while instructed to support as well as to control merchants, hardly ever restricted their own strategies of appropriation to the fees they were entitled to demand. That did not really change when the French government decided to accord salaries to their consuls in order to further their role as instruments of government. In short, notwithstanding the differences between jurisdiction in early modern societies, jurisdictional power offered the chance to appropriate personal wealth. This general characteristic of early modern jurisdiction took on a special form at the Sublime Porte, where the French and English ambassadors were at the same time consuls, the costs of their consular services being partly financed by the Chamber of Commerce in Marseille and the Levin Company in London, respectively. Apart from the situation at the Sublime Porte, it was not the combination, but instead the separation of consular and ambassadorial services, which, according to Maïa Pal, forged not only the separation between Christian and non-Christian legal spaces, but also between economic and political spheres. Here, I stumbled over her choice of terminology. If it is meant to suggest that basic structures of capitalist societies were already developing in the diplomatic service at the time of Louis XIV, this would contradict Maïa's theoretical concept of early modernity. And then, if the combination of positions at the Sublime Porte was an exception, the combination of jurisdictional practice with private appropriation, hence, in modern terminology, political with economic accumulation, was not. Instead of interpreting international dominant organizational patterns of diplomatic services as a separation of spheres, we could perhaps simply speak of a more or less clear-cut division in the hierarchy of jurisdictional positions. In the small German principalities, for example, where ambassadorial services tended to be assigned to specifically and for short terms employed envoys, consuls and especially general consuls dealt with a rather broad spectrum of duties. My suggestion that instead of stating a separation of spheres, we should rather conceive of early modern jurisdiction as a hierarchically structured general practice, is not contradicted by the fact that the formal separation of consular and ambassadorial services survived the end of Ancien regime forms of domination. The tradition may have been more or less consciously upheld because it offered the possibility to associate the position of ambassador with the high social status it had inherited from processes of aristocratization. It's really a terrible term. I would like to conclude with a question. It's a real question and not a critical statement veiled in the form of a question. I agree with Mäia and political Marxists in general that capitalism is a social relation that is politically constituted. I do not know if for Mäia this also implies that the dominance of capitalist social relations could only become historically possible if and when early modern forms of domination had been decisively curtailed, if not altogether destroyed. But I did take note of the fact that while we both insist on refuting any concept of a determinate historical development leading to capitalist bourgeois societies, my own analysis contains the inevitability of a structural crisis of the forms of domination which characterized European societies of the European regime. The most important reason for this crisis resulting from the political economic system of privileges. In Mäia's terminology, that would be a historically specific crisis of the political economy of jurisdictional accumulation. Of course, the concept of the structural crisis applies much less to early modern than to capitalist societies, because the former were less integrated and, in spite of jurisdictional accumulation, much less systematically governed. This notwithstanding, there existed social as well as economic limits to the governmental strategy of granting jurisdictional power to individuals, which were then in a position to privately appropriate some of the wealth in the principalities in question. That Mäia refrains from debating the possibility or even inevitability of a structural crisis of jurisdictional accumulation invites the specification of my concluding question. It may be that the differences between the development of jurisdictional accumulation in the four empires under discussion prohibit any assumption about a general condition for crisis. It is also possible that in spite of the fact that, as Mäia convincingly argues, internal and external developments were closely connected, an exception has to be taken into account for the diplomatic services because the positions of consuls and ambassadors may not have been in the same way part and parcel of the competition over advancement and chances of appropriation as those in the interior of early modern societies. This would mean that Mäia's focus on the international explains why there is no discussion of the relevance of jurisdictional accumulation for the structural crisis of early modern forms of domination in her book. It may also be that Mäia simply did not want to deal with the historical possibility of capitalism in the context of this book. And last but not least, it may be that my own analysis is wrong.
Thank you, Heide. That was great. Fred, do you want to go next?
All right, then. Well, Mäia, first, congratulations for the book. It is a really great expansion to the political Marxist tradition. The book reminded me a lot of, just for the format, a lot of the book of Colin Morse, actually, even in the case selection and so on. And I'll continue a little bit on this. Well, I think it's a major contribution to political Marxism in what political Marxists do best. And this is understanding how the diversity of an historical epoch it is really important to understand like varieties of patterns of power and to answer to most of post-colonial scholars who European relations of power as the same. And this is, here you have a very strong diachronical distinction between, synchronical distinction, between case and between different patterns of social property regime, balances of class force, and so on. Then the diachronical distinction is also very interesting. Now you're really adding something to political Marxism by problematizing even more that period, this early modern period. And since I work in sociology now more than in political science, I find this very important to challenge a lot of Weberian sociology, for instance, which just goes from pre-modern to modern without stopping at this early modern period and looking at what is going on here. So this is also a very important contribution. The actors that you're looking at, the sub-sovereign diplomatic and imperial actors, are extremely interesting. When you started with the pub stuff, I was really looking, okay, I hope she's going to talk about that. And unfortunately, it disappeared a little bit later, but it was a really good start. I don't think the book is Eurocentric that much. With Thierry Lapointe, we made a distinction earlier on in the literature between Eurocentric and Euro-centered. And I think in French, it's a very important distinction. Something which is Eurocentré is not necessarily Eurocentric. And your book is more Euro-centered, even though you're talking a lot about the Mediterranean. So my questions are not so much coming from international law scholarship, partly because I did not have to be convinced. I think I was already very skeptical about the commodity form theory of laws. My questions are more coming from how do I present this kind of work to other sociologists, to other historical sociologists, and especially in Quebec, which is former New France, as you know. And New France is a very interesting case to test your material because first, New France was in this early modern period, and after the Second Year War, New France, most of the Haut et le Bas Canada were absorbed into the British Empire. Okay, so how does that work out here? Okay, and not only this, but there's also all the relation that needs to be explained. Why did the English and the French chose very different set of alliance with First Nation in Canada? How did the French social property regime and the English social property regime in Canada led to very different patterns of social development until the 1950s? It was still very different in both regions, okay? So how did that later develop into a form of internal colonialism, which is still an heritage from that period? Okay, so these are questions that I had in mind. I didn't have all the answers to these questions, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about this later. But my first question is on the question of juridical accumulation. And here I want to push you a little bit to clarify your choice of concept. And this is the debate actually between an historicist Marx and an analysis which would be either starting from Foucault or Schmitt. And I'd like to know why more about how you articulate the distinction between jurisdiction and sovereignty. And for you, it's clear that sovereignty is like a subcategories of jurisdiction. So I want you to push this a little bit more. Okay, I need this to be really unpacked for me because it has major consequences on how we theorize then sovereignty and so on. Okay. So, for instance, in the literature in international law, how does this switch from sovereignty to jurisdiction help us to understand explain processes or outcomes that theories who prioritize sovereign enclave, sovereign corridors cannot make or understand. Okay, in a nutshell, why do we need to start from Maïa Pal rather than Foucault or Schmidt? Okay. The second set of questions is more about historical sociology. I see very well what is historical in the method here. It is less clear how this is sociology per se. And this is not like a critique of your work, but I think that IR scholars who argue that they do historical sociology are sometimes not enough concerned about why is this a sociology exactly, okay, and why should sociologists take an engagement with this literature. And this leads me to push you on the agency structure debate that you talk about, okay? And the way I see it from here is that I don't really see why this opposition between the very structuralist versus a more agency historicist-based opposition. Where does that lead us? Okay. What do we gain exactly from this? And the reason I'm asking this question is because in sociology, I mean, there's no, this agency structures debate is not existing anymore. I mean, nobody thinks that just agency matter or just structure matters. Okay, there's a lot of a very long continuum of position between these two. And even in the work of Brenner, I think you see these two contradictions. Okay, you see these. If you have a more generous reading of Brenner, I'm not saying you don't have one, but what I see in the literature is people picking Brenner's contribution to the book on analytical Marxism, where what I see Brenner doing is explaining economist, philosopher, sociologist, why an historical perspective matters. And the argument is very short, it's very analytic. But if you look at Merchants and Capitalism or Merchants and Revolution, the argument is much more broad, much more generous. And we see that it's different level of argumentation. So I'd like to know more about where you position yourself in this debate. And maybe a little bit more about the concept of rules that you're taking from this, okay? I don't see rule as a law, okay? A law like a historical law. I really see rule, and what I think was very interesting in Benno's 2003 book, in The Myth of 1648, was the idea that rules were part of a generic grammar, okay? So in generic grammar was not leading to a deterministic mode of understanding strategies of actor. It was more about settling like different patterns of possible course of actions, different set of strategies coming out of the rules of reproduction. And that's a little bit what I'm seeing when I'm looking at New Friends, actually. I have more questions for you later, but I'm going to stop with just one more question, very directly linked to the political Marxist tradition. It's the question of the relative absence of the seigneurie in your work. And this is for someone coming from Quebec, it's like it has to be central somewhere. I mean, the mode of occupation of land here in Quebec was la seigneurie. That was absolutely central, and that was absolutely central for the non-capitalist development. So I'd like to hear more about how you put these things in common in dialogue as a specific mode of French expansionism. Okay, the expansion of the seigneurial system, but also specific form of French jurisdictional accumulation. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. Rob, do you want to go next?
Hi. I once again, as is often the case with the HM thing, feel like I've been thrown to the lions of political Marxism versus me, the little old not political Marxist saying vulgar structuralist things. But nonetheless, I will persevere and say what I have to say. Again, just fulfilling my historical function. I think things have historical functions. You guys don't. I understand that, but I definitely do. So I don't think at this point it's necessary to say too many good things about the book, although of course I could go on and on and on. Although, you know, Mäia and I have fairly major disagreements, I think it's straightforwardly important to recognize the kind of scope and contribution of the book, both in terms of kind of its analytical attempts to like move on, the kind of scope of its analysis and its attempt to reformulate a kind of historical perspective. So I think one of the things that in a sense has been queued up for me to do would be to talk about the commodity form theory, in part because, you know, some people find it unconvincing. I don't find it unconvincing. And I am part of a strand that thinks that it gives us a useful set of intellectual and political resources, think about law and international law. And so this is something I have a commitment to. Obviously, in part, that will be something that I want to touch upon. I think one of the issues with that might be, and one of the things that often comes up in these conversations, is that can simply be a boring conversation, right? Because of course, in a way, all we can say is like, we both just disagree on things. We have fairly fundamental theoretical disagreements about how Marxism works, about how the world works, about what we're dealing with. And those disagreements at certain points can just become irreconcilable and therefore boring. You know, I'm like, I love forms. You guys like, I hate forms, and on and on and on and on and on. An infantile, infinite dispute. So what I thought might be more useful in this context is, whilst keeping that stuff in mind, put on a couple of issues on the table, specifically about law and the role that law plays in Mäia's argument. And that can raise, I think, some broader questions about things like contingency, necessity, structure, and agency. So to just put up some of those broader theoretical debates that Mäia is interested in talking about. I mean, the first thing I wanted to say, and this is a super boring thing to say, but I feel the need to say it, is that I think I would disagree to some degree with the way in which Mäia would characterize some of the commodity form theory stuff. Now, I'm not going to go too much into, like, you know, man defends small differences of his own position, but I do think that part of the account that Mäia places on this is reading it in too rigid a kind of base superstructural way, as if it's like law grows from commodity exchange, which is never really what Patricianus was about, as far as I can see, because he's much more in that kind of like value form tradition where it's not one follows the other, but specifically that law is a mystified form of appearance of capitalist social relations. So at one point, Mäia, like drawing on Benno's work, is like, wow, this can't understand the co-constitutive relationship between law and capitalism, among other things. But precisely the kind of core insight of what Patricianus is trying to say is that they are co-constituted, because law is an immediate form of commodity exchange in a particular thing. You can't have one without the other. I mean, it's very telling that one of the big early criticisms of Patricianus was that he could collapse space and superstructure into the same thing by arguing that commodity exchange was both immediately legal and economic. But we'll come back to that. So the big thing then that I think is commodity formish, but is a broader question, is what we could call is the jurisprudential question about the relationship between law and capitalism and law and other things. So one thing that I think is important, right, is that Mäia, as with many other people in the political Marxist tradition, wants to say we need to be able to differentiate capitalism or capitalist social property relations from other forms of social property relations. And we need to do that historically, but also theoretically, to understand the difference between capitalism and non-capitalism. But the argument that many people would put forward is, well, you also have to do that for something like law and for other social fields, social forms, whatever, so that you can understand the specificity of law or whatever else, as opposed to some generic sense of rules, force, or whatever. And so one of the things that I would like to hear more about in relation to the book and why I'm interested in is that I think that, for reasons I can understand, the book isn't wanting to be quite pinned down on that. So for instance, one of the early points that gets made is almost like a sleight of hand, where it's like, well, jurisdiction is the right to invoke the law, so law is jurisdiction, so we can just kind of move on from that. And I'm like, no, that's not, to me, that is not sufficient. That is dodging the question about what we mean by law, subsuming into a category of jurisdiction, because of course, not all law is about jurisdiction, I don't think, and then just moving on beyond that. So I'm like, oh, I want to hear more about this. Similarly, right, when we then get a discussion about the advantage of a political Marxist approach over other approaches in relation to law, it's, well, the thing is that because we understand social property relations, we can see how social practices like law relate to all these other social practices. But still, I'm like, but what characterizes law as a specific social practice then? Like, I want to hear more about this. So there's some very good discussion, I think, about law as a process, which I agree with, and other things, but not quite pinning down what the specificity of that is, because many social practices are indeed processes. Indeed, one might say all of them are social processes, and many of them involve people projecting power through institutions, if you want to get to law like that. So I'm left slightly at that point like, oh, well, what do we mean by that? So why do I think that that's a problem, and how does that dovetail with a series of other things that come up in the book? Well, the first thing is that I worry that the kind of easy solution to this is to slide into a certain kind of messy legal pluralism, which is just like, we're going to have a really wide understanding of what we mean by law. And it usually means something like rules backed up by authority or something, which doesn't help us pin down what is at least distinctive in our social imaginary about law, because rules backed up by force characterizes so many forms of human behavior. It doesn't give us a differentiation point. Why is that important? Well, at least part of the ambition that Pashikanis had in his stuff, and people around like subsequently have been saying, is we want to understand law as a specific social relationship, the way that we might understand capitalism, a specific social relationship. And the reason that we want to do that is because it gives us a sense of the limits of law as a site for political struggle, right? Now, this is where we get into this kind of messy set of debates. So Mäia is, I think, correct to point out that one of the aims of the Marxist tradition is always to have an emancipatory sense, because we say like things could have been different, things don't have to be this way, and there is like space for struggle and agency. But at least as I've always understood the Marxist tradition, this is where we get into our structure agency thing, part of the specificity of the Marxist tradition, as opposed to the generic socialist movement that preceded it, is to be like, but these struggles happen within limits. Those limits might be, in Brenner's language, rules of reproduction. They might be structural limits, but it is the idea that if we specify the social relations and practices in which things are happening, we also specify the possible limits of that. That isn't to say that something is impossible, right? But it is to say maybe it's more unlikely. So the reason I think that is then important in this context and for thinking about like law as a specific social field and what that might mean is because it's true, like lots of different things could happen in law. Tomorrow, aliens could like invade the planet and like make us all into communists, but we're not going to like bank on that. We're going to have to think about like what the limits and things are. So one of the reasons why I want to ask about that again is, whilst there are many contingent possibilities, I don't think it is unfair to be like, given the empirical historical detail we have on what has been achieved by law, pretty universally, there are some hard limits to what you can do inside of law, at least thus far. And at the very least, it's more difficult to do that. So my sense, and why I want to push a little bit back on this, is like, so how do we understand law specifically and particularly in this way? And what does that then say for us about the political limits on what we're doing? And I think that's important because we've heard a lot of talk about the juridical throughout these talks. But if the juridical isn't just going to stand in as a random hand-wavy term for whatever we want it to, I'm not accusing anyone of doing that, then we need to have, I think, a more rigorous sense of what that juridical is and why it's different from something else. It's presumably on some level different from the political, or a specific form in which the political is articulated. Otherwise, there's simply no point talking about the juridical as a category. So for me then, to close on all of that stuff, like one of the things I think that Mäia says, which is really interesting, but with which I massively disagree, is that, and I'll just get up the quote, if the juridical is part of this continuous structure Wood identifies, this means that it is not approached as an expression of the commodity form, but rather as a terrain of social conflict. Now, I think Mäia knows what I'm going to say, which is that people like me would be like, well, something can be an expression of something and also a terrain of social conflict at the same time. Like, indeed, that's what I would think of as the core argument of people saying here, that it's like things can be both terrains of social conflict, but also expressions of other social forces. And that expression, if you like, although I wouldn't use the term expression, help provide the limit and talks about the shape that those political struggles will take. And I think that there is something to that, because of course we do need to have an account of why it is that certain struggles have been very difficult to represent legally, and why, for instance, the international communist movement never, in fact, very explicitly was like, we're not going to be putting all of our faith or any of our faith in legal mechanisms to do that. They had an analysis and a reason for that, and I think we need to talk more about what that might be. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. That was great. Mäia, you have a lot to work through. What is your response to all of it?
Thank you so much, everybody. Yeah, I have a million notes, and I'm not so good at thinking quickly on my feet, so I hope I'm going to get through some of these at least in appropriate way. Okay, so maybe I'll come back. I was kind of thinking at the end of Rob's points there that there was some interesting links with what Heide was saying actually about her concepts and her understanding of ancien regime. So part of me wants to try and maybe link those questions together, but I think I need to also think a bit about them a bit more in my head while I'm dealing with other things that might be a little bit simpler. So maybe I'll come back to what Fred actually was asking me as maybe an introduction and some of the broader questions around sociology, historical sociology, jurisdiction and sovereignty, which I think links to what Rob's questions in terms of clarifying what I actually mean by law and by jurisdiction, and then come to this difficult question of structure, limits, and various forms of political appropriation, which I think is what Heide was also coming to. I think I'll mention the pub analogy that I use in the book that Fred referred to, because I also love that, and I wish I could have come back to it in the book. It kind of emerged. So while I was working on the book, and the book is my PhD thesis, but it's so much more. I didn't deal at all with consuls or diplomats in the thesis, so all that was kind of new research, and I just got obsessed with consuls and what was happening, what they were doing, and what was happening in the Mediterranean. And so there's this great kind of anecdote that these consuls had sort of the consular offices in each port and trading city, and they were allowed to have an ale house because they weren't allowed to go to the pubs and other ale houses in the city in which they were in. So they were, it was important that they were given this right to their own ale house. And obviously they traveled between, some merchants would come in there, and it was just, this perfect image of the interactions and encounters that would happen in all these ports, and then this is links to a lot of what the circulation to some extent debates and literature is a lot more emphasizing in terms of what's happening, the kind of transnational cosmopolitan aspect of early modern economies, right? And thinking about Campling and Collis's book on Capitalism in the Sea, which focuses a lot on this as well, and Gyro Spinagi's work, etc. So, it made a lot of sense for me to kind of start from there and try and think through the importance of these things. And then that got lost because obviously there's no way I could go into a deep research of ale houses in the early modern period. That's going to be hopefully a project, a vanity project somewhere down the line. But the point was to just illustrate the complexity of these port trading cities and to come to how I understand jurisdiction, right? And what interested me was the innovative aspect of what jurisdiction entails. And there's a literature in international law and critical international law about emphasizing more jurisdiction as this pre-legal phase. And Rob is absolutely right to say, well, that's all well and good, but that doesn't mean that all law is then jurisdiction. And, although it has this kind of de facto practical element to establishing, to not so much establishing, well, the de facto practical aspect of saying the law, but also, establishing oneself in a new territory and developing new practices, which then later on will be codified, legally entrenched through treaties or institutions in various ways. So there is a sort of chronological process that first you have jurisdiction and then you have law. And obviously that is problematic in many ways, because then once the law is established, what happens to jurisdiction in a way? And then jurisdiction becomes this much smaller aspect of the law, which is more about who has the right to exercise justice in a specific context, right? So then the more kind of general understanding of jurisdiction as just a conflict of laws when there's a dispute over who should arbitrate or adjudicate in a specific context, over whom, etc. And then that becomes a more technical question, right? But so we have to differentiate obviously between those things. And I'm obviously more interested in the notion of jurisdiction as a practice, rather than that kind of specific technical exercise of determining who has jurisdiction where. So sovereignty in that sense is that later process of the establishment of the right. It's once the jurisdictional process has happened, if you want, sovereignty is then the acquired rights, the acquired property relation through which sovereigns or other claimants can reproduce or justify their claims and their ownership, right? So, the alehouse in a way is an interesting example of certain actors, pushing for the consequences of their jurisdictional privilege or their right, and doing so in a context which today would be odd and wouldn't fit in our current capitalist setup. And that links now a little bit to Heide was asking me, and some really tough and excellent questions about, I'll try and look at my notes to say them properly, but to what extent capitalism, to what extent what I'm arguing in terms of jurisdictional accumulation is defined by a structural crisis, or whether it gets reproduced, whether jurisdictional accumulation in the early modern period gets reproduced or abandoned through the structural crisis that then capitalism brings about, right? I hope I'm not sure I've translated very well what you said, but I think I've got the gist of your point, and it's a really, really good question. And I'm not sure I have an answer to it in the book, and perhaps not even now since. And I have been struggling with that question of aspects of jurisdictional accumulation that overlapped with capitalist structures, right? And that was something that I tried to kind of skirt around in a way by talking about exceptions or talking about overlaps, and the English or British case is particular to that. And I'll come. The case of New France and what became Canada is illustrative of the struggles and the contest between the French and the English-British system of accumulation, right? And so the question was that I had to answer while I was writing and thinking about jurisdictional accumulation is that, is the processes the practices that the English empire develops in its colonies in Americas, a form of capital accumulation, right? And that's a really tough question, because it is and it isn't. I needed to differentiate the specific practices that were happening there, but at the same time, they were necessarily embedded with the structures of capital accumulation, whether that's agrarian capitalism in terms of improvement, waste, trying to rethink through the kind of settlements that were being established and eradicating indigenous property eradicating it by ignoring it. So a lot of the cases of the merchant companies and the settlers through various courts and the Privy Council in the 17th, 18th century were basically based on completely ignoring any claim to any indigenous claim to property. Right, and the point about seigneurie is well put. I definitely don't discuss it enough for a variety of reasons that it felt if I went into there, it would take me another chapter, if not more, to deal with the complexity of what the seigneurie process. But for me, it exemplified in general that kind of outsourced process of transport or authority, where you had and perhaps in that sense it was a little bit more exceptional and a bit more similar to the transplant authority than the British system. But in terms of keeping a specific structure of social property relations, that was that enabled a kind of an overlap between the negotiations that the French traders had to maintain at first, and then which they developed later into seigneurie, right? So I understand there's a specific type of settlement that reflected the specificities of the French case, of the French Ancien Régime, but which nevertheless had to adapt to the conditions of and the more difficult conditions of colonization in those territories. Right. So from the beginning, the French had to negotiate. They had to acknowledge indigenous lands and ways of doing much more than the British did later on. So there you have those differences there. And you can, those hiccups when then obviously it goes, those territories goes to the English or the British, you still have those struggles there. And there are interesting stories, interesting work, scholarship on how those struggles played out in various contexts as well. So, but yeah, I take that point, that much more could be said on that. But I suppose I'm going to try and kind of deal a bit more with, and I know I'm skipping over a really important point you all made. Actually, I'll try and deal with Fred's point about why historicist Marx and not Foucault or Schmitt, because that's a really interesting one. So again, I think it speaks to, Schmitt was useful for me to read, right, when I was working during my PhD, and to try and think of the differences between the French and the British especially. It was really about getting away from what I saw as very teleological process of historical formation, right? So, although Schmitt, you have to recognize the historical richness of what he was, of a lot of his analysis of British and French forms of imperialism and the difference between the British liberalism and the French forms of appropriation. You nevertheless have this, inherent search for this common, search for the enemy, obviously, and this ultimate differentiation to German processes, obviously, and why the Germans couldn't do the same. So that for me was extremely problematic. And in a way, in Foucault, you have a kind of linearity as well about sovereignty, and it's such a focus on governmentality that for me is different. The point for me with jurisdiction was to really try and break down and have a more neutral, in a way, process. Although a lot of my argument is to politicize jurisdiction, and this speaks a bit to Rob, right, to say that these processes are not purely legal, they're not purely or technically legal. I also wanted to kind of broaden out those processes and make them fit into aspects of the early modern period. So, I think there are clear sociological gains to have there, and I'll take on board as well your point about rule, which I could have clarified more. I think I mean it in a much more general sense as well. I don't know how I'm doing for time. I feel like I don't want to overstep too much. I need to deal with Rob's points and the structure issue. So I'll deal with that, and maybe we can open up a bit more for responses and questions. this difficult question about the limits. Where are the limits in this narrative, I guess, or in this analytical setup? And obviously, those weren't the main focus of the book. The whole point of the book was to open up the possibilities of how we understand the early modern period. So I guess I would want to obviously push back on setting up those limits, right? And it's totally fair to say, and I think I'm quite generous to commodity form theory of law in the book, actually, in the sense that I acknowledge its nuances and its strengths, and it's not an anti-Pashukanist analysis at all. And in the book, I focus a lot more on Mieville, actually, than Pashukanist. So I totally take that on board. I am, far from an expert on Pashukanist theory themselves, and I think there's a lot more there that can be taken out and better nuanced and better elaborated. It's not about completely rejecting the quantity form theory law, but it's at being more precise about what it can and can't do. And what it can't do is historically explain why, the whole world didn't go capitalist in one go or at the same time. And that problem of, in a way, of course, it is a problem of contingency and of being able to identify why things could have gone otherwise, and why certain processes are not. You mentioned very well this law is both the commodity exchange is immediately economic and legal under capitalism, right? But the whole point is, for me, was to argue, well, it happens in variegated aspects, and in the context in which it happens in France is very different to the context in which it happens in England, and very different to the context in which it happens in the Dutch case, and again in Castile, and again in their colonies, and we have to look specifically at how that process of commodification happens and who are the actors that are part of that process, and they change in each case. And that's just the reality of, and if you want to, I can call that contingency if we want, but it's also for me just the reality of how these processes occur. And that of course, there's a danger of falling into a messy legal pluralism, and a lot of the literature, as you know, that I use it is known as plural. But I don't think it's fair to just. I've lost my screen. I don't think it's fair to say that acknowledging the specificities of different imperial expansion is necessarily just messy legal pluralism, because of course there are limits that are being set up, and the limits are accumulation, right? Rules about accumulation. And where I stand on the structure agency debate, it's a little bit on the fence to some extent, although I would put myself as a radical historicist. But I guess, I'm seeing Javi wanting to come in. Should I I've been talking for a long time, so I should stop. There's so many great questions and points. I wanted to do justice to at least some of them. Javi, come in, stop me, please.
Thank you, Maia. We have time, so if you want to return to the questions and expand later, we probably will have time. We have one question in the chat from Panayotis Sotiris, and the question is quite concrete, is how can we relate the expansion of consular rights in the Ottoman Empire to questions regarding social property relations in the Ottoman social formation, including aspects such as letting non-Muslim subjects of the empire take over significant parts of trade and economic activity. And building on this quite concrete question, I'd like to ask one myself to abuse my chair rights. I wanted to go back to the distinction that you draw between different forms of imperial jurisdiction. And I noticed that in, the division between transplant and transports of authority pretty much applies to the Castilian Empire and to the rest. The French Empire in Europe does a transplant of authority, but not in the colonial transoceanic context in the Western Hemisphere, let's say. So why why is it that Castilian colonialism in the Americas was distinct in the way that it projected its imperial jurisdiction? Does it have to do something to do with its distinct social property relations, or is there another reason for that?
Thanks, Javi. I'll deal with Panagiotis's question, and hopefully it will help as well. Those concrete examples will help to come back to some of the analytical issues I was trying to grapple with earlier on. So how can we relate the expansion of consular rights in the Ottoman Empire to social property relations in the Ottoman social formation? So I think the history there is, the one that I discuss anyway in the book is relating to the rights and privileges that so foreign residents, merchants, and thereby consuls developed in various cities of the Ottoman Empire, so various trading cities and ports. And absolutely, the social property relations of the Ottoman Empire helped to determine this. I mean, in any case, and that will be the case with the Castilian or Spanish Empire as well, right? The specifics of those formations of how politics rule, as a generative grammar was set up, the limits and possibilities that were available, or in the discourse or in the actual institutions that actors were presented with, then determines a lot of the international, I guess, what we would now see as international aspects of these questions. So in the case of the Ottoman, the reason why foreign merchants, residents, consuls were able to develop such autonomous and independent communities is because the Sultan let them, right? So capitulations, the specific treaties or privileges that were accorded to foreigners across the Ottoman Empire were at first, really a way for the Ottoman Sultan to simplify a situation in which they didn't want to try and deal with trying in a sense of being, legally responsible for the actions of foreigners. They didn't fit in their system of their legal system, and therefore it was just easier to give these foreigners these privileges. They didn't see it as a threat. They saw it as a mark of their own dominance to be able to give foreigners those privileges, right? So the Ottoman Empire was the most important actor at the time. It was, far more powerful and dominant than any other European empire in the up until the 16th, 17th century. So letting non-Muslim subjects take over parts of trade, it wasn't seen as that, right? It became that in the 19th century. And Europeans more and more abused that system of capitulations, developed much bigger communities, allied between themselves, because at first they were all fighting and, being rivals in the Mediterranean, but then, they gradually also start to ally themselves. And Heide mentioned this when I make about the Christian and non-Christian legal spaces. And you see this developing in the words of consuls, where they ally between themselves as a Christian community in the face of the Ottoman difference, Ottoman others, in spite of rivaling between each other, also very competitively and very aggressively. So those, you see that quite early in the early modern period already, which was threw me, some problems, because I didn't, I think that those assumptions are made for later in the 19th century, but you do actually see them to some extent quite earlier on. So foreigners then took advantage of these situations and managed to turn what were privileges accorded to them into big advantages, which then contributed to the decline of the Ottoman Empire and forced a way in which Europeans in the region imposed their own system of legal relations. And then you have this whole narrative in the 19th century about how the European legal system is much superior and should be the standard. And you have those kind of, very racialized actual arguments about law, right? Which is, becomes really interesting. And so that links a bit to the question of Javi of the Spanish case as well. There you have a different setup where the Castilian state is, as you know, and Javi and I have been having many discussions about this throughout the years as well, and his work has helped me a lot think through this. But it's not really a state, obviously. It's a specific kind of central patched up kingdom, and it's very based on legal justifications and theology, and this had a big a role in how it decided to colonize and the different subjectivities it accorded not only Amerindians but Native Americans, but settlers as well. So there's these struggles that happen between the settlers, the Amerindians, and the monarchy is actually playing off the Amerindians against the settlers because it wants to reassert control over the settlers. And again, it's issues of basically taxing trade and making sure that it's trade and production on settlements. So the social property relations of each locale helps to understand their colonial imperial actions. And I guess that's what sets my book apart to a lot of the literature on this to some extent, which argues first that what's happening first in the colonies is what's important, and then that helps us to understand the process of colonization. And I do want to push back a little bit against that and say, well, no, obviously the social property relations of the Ancien Regime, of the Castilian monarchy, of also the Dutch Republic, which we haven't touched upon, but is a big debate in terms of transition. Those affect the potential of merchants to have certain rights, to be able to, their relation to their state, to various organizations like the Chambre de Commerce, and there's an important several of these organizations in Amsterdam, and the Levant Company that was mentioned, and other trading companies, and those jurisdictional relations between those actors are really key. So I don't know if I want to come back. Should I come back to some of the points that Rob has raised, or I have no idea of time or where we are, Javi. So let me know if there are any other questions in the chat.
Well, we have quite a bit of time. We've got, I would say we have plenty of time. If you want to return to the questions, or perhaps the discussants want to ask another quick round, a shorter one, building up on what Maïa has responded, and maybe we can also give Maïa some time to collect her thoughts and finish the response to the barrage of questions that you have all put her through. So maybe who wants to go first? Perhaps Heide, do you have any follow-up questions? Heide, I believe you're muted.
Okay, now it should be. Not to Maïa, but to Rob. I think your criticism is a little bit based too much on identifying jurisdiction with law. And I think one of the results of Maïa's analysis is to accept that jurisdiction was a practice. And it's not only a practice that's law. I mean, you stress the question of rule too much, in my opinion. Maybe you can go back to that a bit. Because if you argue with Pashukanis, of course you argue with rules. You argue with law. You don't argue with the practice. And jurisdiction was not only the practice of law, but the practice of governing.
should we collect follow-up questions from the discussants? Fred, do you have any follow-up questions you want to ask?
I was just thinking about what Heide just said, and I think maybe one example of this in New France was the fact that when the British Army won and conquered New France, one of the things that happened is that the former generals from the British Army asked to have seigneurie. So they were really competing for a French strategies of accumulation. And they didn't abolish neither civil law nor the seigneurie, because it enables them to accumulate both prestige, title, but French title, which they decided to let in Owenbach, Canada. So this is a very, very strange combination, but I think it illustrates the point.
Rob?
Do you want me to answer or formulate my question, or which?
Whichever, man. Whichever you prefer.
Look, I've got a flip answer, but it's not an inaccurate answer. Law is in the title of the book. Like, there are chapters on law. Like, I can be forgiving slightly for focusing on the thing I know about in that context. So I think that that's not wrong, though. But I will say a couple of things that then come into this. So the first is that, of course, the idea of jurisdiction is bigger than law, but it is also not inaccurate to say that the book draws on, at least in part, sometimes a specific formulation of jurisdiction which has been formulated in the context of legal theory. And this isn't in the book in that way. Like, I know that Maia's work does go beyond that, and she's thinking about differential forms of different things that are being accumulated in that process of jurisdiction accumulation, but law is in there. So that is one thing. There is this background of a legal theoretical development of the concept of jurisdiction, which is in part in that book. And again, that's kind of what I know about. Now, I'm quite happy to say that the jurisdiction in some sense exceeds the law. But that then also implies that you have an account of what the law is to be exceeded. So if you're saying the jurisdiction is not just the law, then that means that you now have an understanding of what the law is such that this jurisdiction can go beyond it. So my question then is, well, what do you mean by that? Like, what do you mean by the law as a specific set of practices, field, whatever, that differentiates it from these other forms of jurisdiction? Why is that important? Because I think in part that's an important part of the story, which I think, I think Maïa is actually very good in the book about unpacking it, which is that if jurisdictional accumulation is composed of divergent and variegated sets of different forms of practices, then the balance with which those practices express those forms of jurisdiction is in itself an interesting question. So we might say, for instance, if we're thinking about, and whatever, because I'm sure I don't want to be accused of teleology or whatever, but if we're thinking then about what differentiates the early modern period from other periods, is part of that the prevalence of legal practices in jurisdictional practices in later historical periods. So to what degree does the law, for whatever reason, contingent outcome of struggles, but tend to displace these other forms of jurisdictional accumulation in later periods? What that suggests to me is that I want an account of the specificity of law as a jurisdictional practice, as distinct from these other ones, or an explanation of why that isn't the case. The reason that's also important, right, is because at least in part, the book is doing several things, and how one responds to the book, of course, is in part related to what you are doing. I write legal research. There is like a thing specifically on international legal theory, and I named it. So of course, what I will tend to be thinking about in that context is precisely those kind of issues, and they're there in the book. Now, the thing about rules is specific because actually, of course, the point of Patrick is that he doesn't think that law is about rules. He thinks that law is a social relationship, a particular form. Like, he is absolutely the case that he's like, rules are not what we're interested in. So part of what I'm getting at here is that insofar as you do not explicate what is distinct about law, even in these jurisdictional practices, you tend to fall back almost by definition on an idea of law as being rules in some kind of sense, which actually makes it more difficult to map out the kind of different historical practices that Mäia is talking about, because everything can just, and I'm not, the problem is, I'm not, this is not like some kind of big attack on Maia's book. Mäia doesn't like the book, but like, it's like, you run a danger of making jurisdiction into this smushy melange of all this different stuff, which you don't want to do if you're trying to like work through the different practices. So in a sense, right, what I'm also saying is, if we're thinking about levels of abstraction, right, there's one form of specificity, which is the specificity of like your like the historicist specificity. Now I'll quibble with that, because we could go even further. We could be like, well, what was this atom doing with this atom at this point? Like finding the cutoff point for that is very difficult. But there is a determinate form of abstraction beyond just the like empirical, which is like we want to differentiate between different types of practices so that we don't just collapse them into one, even if we're not doing that precisely on the level of, oh, what did this particular actor say in this context? And something, the idea of capitalism is of course one of those forms of abstraction, right? So when I'm thinking about this law question, it's all taking that stuff into account, which is that even if we say that jurisdiction exceeds the law and that these early modern practices of jurisdiction were not simply about law, they were also about law, and you will want to have an account of how that differentiates. And the book is also in part, I think very significantly, an intervention into international legal theory and history. And so I think the question on that basis does need to be asked.
Thanks to all of you for coming back on this. And yeah, I think this is really fascinating and helps me a lot. Okay, so I think a good way of maybe wrapping this up and giving it some flesh is also to try and think about, how these concepts help us to understand what's happening after the early modern period, right? And I think what Rob is trying to get at as well is, to what happens to jurisdiction when capitalism universalizes, right? And what happens to jurisdictional accumulation in my narrative? And that's the big question that has been haunting me after writing the book as well, is, what happens to my concept? Is it something that I, want to use to understand what's happening today? I mean, there's been so much analysis of kind of what some people call a new medievalism, or, the kind of fragmentation of the international order today, all the various jurisdictional actors and the way in which jurisdiction today is can be used as a concept, right? And so there's obviously a temptation for me to broaden that concept out and say, well, yes, there are aspects of today's international order that reflect this kind of early modern process of jurisdictional accumulation, and therefore this concept has, even more purchase, etc. But I've been trying to resist that, to be honest, and I don't think I want to really go down that route, not yet anyway, without thinking about it more. And I think it's, I have to tackle it in a way to answer better Rob's question about differentiating law and jurisdiction. So obviously, the concept is not meant to just replace law, and just using jurisdiction to just replace law would defeat the point of developing a Marxist analysis of these concepts, right? And you're absolutely right, Rob. The point is to try and understand law as a social relation and to break that down at the same time as understanding, what are the transformations that happen with capitalism that limit that concept and that make it necessarily problematic, right? And that we constantly come back as Marxists to the critique of law, to the critique of human rights, the critique of these processes as supposedly salvaging or being a savior to what we're living, right? So we constantly have to come back to that critique of legal solutions to our predicament. And I would hope that my work is part of that critique, right? It's not about just replacing and giving a jurisdiction an easier pass just because it wasn't considered capitalist, right? Clearly, it becomes subsumed in processes of capital accumulation further down the line. And I think that's what Heide's questions were also trying to get me to clarify. What are the big structural crises in political domination that do away with those more messy, fragmented early modern forms, and which set up the modern state as this standard that gets reproduced then much more easily, and which specific ruling classes really associate with, right? So it's tricky, because at the same time the book wants to say something about agency. It's obviously much more about agency than structure. It's trying to say, look, what's happening in the early modern period is much more open to different processes, and there could have been more variated developments alongside capitalism. But at the same time, it wants to also acknowledge that capitalism did overall develop through legal processes and as law, right? And in that sense, I do see, and I take on board Mieville's arguments about that international law becomes necessarily the structure of capitalism and through imperialist processes. I think I just disagree on the specificities of which imperial processes and how those actually played out. But eventually, obviously, that process becomes inherently commodified and determined by the needs of a specific or various specific capitalist classes. So I think, there's something there about, seeing, acknowledging the specificity of the early modern period, obviously, but then also acknowledging that the law, for me, in the early modern period means something else to what it means under capitalism. And I guess that would be my easy answer to you, Rob, right? That we're not dealing with the same set of actors or the same set of institutions, and even just comparing, how the French, Dutch, and British or English understood that the term of law, and even more so the Spanish, which I put in a completely different category, really had a completely different sense of what the legal means, through the different social property relations. That's why the Spanish or Castilians developed very different processes and gave settlers and Amerindians different categories, different expectations of what they were supposed to do. And we see this in all the debates around different types of colonization in Northern America and versus South America. Now, how that then becomes subsumed in a capitalist legal process is a different story. And, there are great works that have done that story. Dina's work, Dina Tsubala's work, Rose Parfitt's work, and your work, are much more centered on explaining those capitalist transformations. But I don't think they're antithetical to the story I tell in many ways. Now, I don't think the links have been made, but properly in terms of how that transition then happens, and that's perhaps my next work. I haven't yet, decided, but I think it's, you're absolutely right to push me on this idea of law, on rule, differentiating to sovereignty, but I think it's there, and in any case, I would obviously want to push back against a structural understanding of law and focus more on an agency-based definition of law and how specific actors contribute to that. And I guess jurisdiction was my way of doing that. And it's not about setting up an ideal and fixed relationship between jurisdiction and law. Obviously, I would want to push against that. And it's actually trying to find more contingency, if we want to use that word, or more, movement between those terms. When we translate them, it becomes really tricky as well, right? In French and German, just the term law itself is completely different. So, and I know that's an easy comment to make, and I don't want to fall in that kind of easy linguistic translation, a cop-out. But nevertheless, these are different institutions. They develop differently, and the actors that were involved in them had different different opportunities. So yeah, I guess that would be my pushback. But yeah, the whole post 19th century story needs to be told from that angle as well, and that's more work that needs to be done. So I think I'll leave it there.
Well, great. I mean, we have some time to go. We can wrap it up if everyone is exhausted after that, or we can have some final quick fire responses if you like. How are people feeling about both those options? Fred switching off his camera. He's saying like, no, man, I'm sorry. Just okay. Well, perhaps we can leave it at that for today. That was a really intense discussion. Really brought up, a lot of topics, a lot of things to think about. Yeah, great. Again, Maïa Pal, Jurisdictional Accumulation, shortlisted for the Deutscher Prize. We will know on Friday. Great. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, everybody. That was great. Thanks.
Yes.